Imagine watching someone you love, your own mother, grow weaker, appearing with more bruises, more cuts, more unexplained injuries every week. You want to believe it's just the toll of age, the natural fragility that comes with growing older. But deep down, something doesn't feel right. This is the story of Mrs. Rosa Williams, an elderly black woman who seemed to be battling nothing more than the inevitable effects of aging. Her children, concerned but unsure, installed cameras in her home, hoping to bring some peace of mind and understand why their mother kept hurting herself. What they discovered was far more shocking than they ever imagined. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. In the quiet suburbs of Atlanta, Mrs. Rosa Williams, a 78-year-old black woman, was living a peaceful life with the help of her longtime caregiver, Luis. Recently, however, her children, Angela and Michael, began noticing something unsettling. Mrs. Rosa was appearing with bruises. "Mom, did you hurt yourself again?" Angela asked, staring at the dark bruises marking her mother's arms. "Oh, darling, it's just old age. I've been tripping a lot," Mrs. Rosa would reply with a soft smile, trying to downplay the concern. But this started to unsettle the family, as the falls were happening far too often to be dismissed as mere accidents. Michael tried to stay calm, but his worry grew with each visit. He had always seen his mother as a strong woman, full of courage, who had overcome countless challenges in life. But now, the number of injuries was increasing, and this no longer felt normal. "Are you seeing this, Angela?" he asked his sister, trying to figure out if they were overreacting. "She can't be falling this much all the time." "Something's going on," Angela replied, visibly concerned. The feeling that they were missing something important spread through the family. The persistence of the injuries seemed to challenge their hope that this was just a phase. Luis, the caregiver, was a familiar figure in the house. Always smiling, he handled daily tasks with dedication. He helped Mrs. Rosa get up, prepared her meals, and kept the house tidy. When asked about the bruises, he would simply shrug. "She's stubborn, sometimes tries to do things on her own and ends up hurting herself," he explained. But these explanations were no longer enough to calm Angela and Michael. What had initially seemed like the natural wear of old age now raised suspicions. What if it wasn't just that? What if something darker was behind these bruises? One day, after visiting her mother's house, Angela noticed a deep cut on Mrs. Rosa's arm. "Mom, how did this happen? This doesn't look like a simple fall," she exclaimed, her heart heavy with worry. Mrs. Rosa, with her usual patience, tried to downplay the situation. "It was just a trip, nothing serious, my dear. I'm fine." But Angela's expression showed she wasn't convinced. With each new injury, her intuition told her something more was at play. She could no longer ignore the internal voice screaming for answers. Michael, though calmer, began to feel the weight of responsibility. As the eldest son, he was always the rational one, always trying to see the logical side of things. But now, with the constant repetition of falls and bruises, even he started questioning what was happening. "Are we doing enough for her? Are we missing something we should be seeing?" he asked himself, feeling the anxiety growing. The fear of neglecting their mother's well-being grew alongside the frustration of not having clear answers to what was going on. Mrs. Rosa, on the other hand, still tried to maintain her attitude of overcoming challenges. She had always been a woman of faith, believing that with perseverance, everything could be resolved. "This is just a phase. You don't need to worry so much about me," she would say, wanting to reassure her children while also trying to push away her own fear that maybe her health was truly deteriorating. But no matter how strong she tried to appear, with each new fall, a subtle doubt crept into her heart. Was she really losing control of her body? One particularly tough afternoon, After finding yet another bruise on their mother's legs, Angela confronted Michael. "We can't keep waiting, Mike. There's something seriously wrong here. Don't you think we should investigate further?" Michael, initially reluctant, knew his sister was right. "I just want to make sure we're doing the best for her," he said, trying to contain his own uncertainty. And that's when an idea surfaced. What if they could watch what was really happening, without relying solely on Luis's reports or their mother's vague explanations? Angela, determined to protect her mother, proposed something that changed the course of events. "Let's install cameras in the house. We need to see for ourselves what's happening when we're not here." Michael hesitated for a moment, but deep down, he knew it was the best solution. "I know she won't like it, but we have to make sure she's safe," he responded. And so, the idea of monitoring Mrs. Rosa in her own home began to take shape. The cameras, they thought, would bring clear answers and dispel any doubts about the true cause of the injuries. Luis, always calm, didn't seem bothered by the idea. "Do what you think is best. I just want what's good for Mrs. Rosa," he said, in his usual friendly tone. But Angela and Michael couldn't help but notice something odd in his manner of speaking. It was as if he was being too kind, trying to avoid suspicion. Still, they proceeded with the plan, hoping the recordings would confirm that these were just domestic accidents. The installation of the cameras was discreet, and Mrs. Rosa wasn't told right away. "We don't want her to feel uncomfortable or watched," Angela explained to her brother. The idea was to capture her daily life without interference, to understand exactly what was going on. The cameras were placed in strategic spots: the living room, where she spent most of her time, the kitchen, where many of the falls had occurred, and the hallway connecting her bedroom to the bathroom. Now, it was just a matter of time before the truth would be revealed. The family's tension grew as the days passed. "Will we find something?" Michael asked anxiously as Angela reviewed the first recordings. Deep down, they wanted to believe everything would be explained as simple accidents. But the uncertainty left no room for peace. With each new injury, with every fall, the doubts piled up. Angela could barely sleep, imagining what the cameras might reveal. Michael, trying to stay as practical as possible, couldn't shake the anxiety growing inside him. The revelation was close, and they weren't sure if they were ready to handle what they would discover. After endless nights of worry and conversations that seemed to go in circles, Angela and Michael finally decided they needed to take action. "We can't just keep guessing, Mike. We need to know for sure what's going on," Angela said, her voice filled with determination. Michael nodded, agreeing that it was time to face the situation head-on. They both loved their mother deeply and couldn't bear the thought of anything harming her. That's when Angela suggested installing cameras throughout the house. "If we can't be here all the time, at least the cameras can," she said, and with that, a new plan was set in motion. Angela had heard of families using security cameras to monitor their elderly loved ones, and the idea stuck with her. "We'll place them in all the key areas," she explained. The living room, kitchen, and hallway were the most important, as these were the places where Mrs. Rosa spent most of her time. Michael hesitated at first. "Do you think Mom will be okay with this?" he asked, worried about how his mother might react to the idea of being watched. Angela sighed. "She might not like it, but this isn't about her liking it. It's about keeping her safe," she replied firmly. The decision wasn't easy. Mrs. Rosa had always valued her independence, and the thought of being constantly monitored might upset her. But Angela and Michael knew they had to prioritize her safety. "We won't tell her right away," Angela suggested. "Let's just see what's going on first. Then we'll talk to her about it if we need to." Michael agreed, and they both felt a sense of relief. They were finally doing something to uncover the truth. The installation would take place over the weekend, and for the first time in weeks, Angela felt like they were on the right path. That weekend, a technician came by to set up the cameras. It was a simple process, but the weight of what they were doing felt heavy. The cameras were small, discreet, and placed in areas where they wouldn't easily be noticed. This should cover all the main areas, the technician explained as he installed a camera near the kitchen door. Angela and Michael watched silently, feeling both hopeful and uneasy about what the footage might reveal. Would the cameras show that their mother was simply getting older and clumsier, or would they uncover something far more sinister? As the cameras were installed, Luis, the caregiver, continued his routine as usual. He didn't seem fazed by the new surveillance, offering only a passing comment, "If it helps keep her safe, then it's a good thing." But there was something about his demeanor that didn't sit right with Angela. She couldn't shake the feeling that Luis was hiding something, though she had no proof. Michael, on the other hand, tried to stay neutral. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he reminded his sister. "We'll see what the cameras show before we start assuming anything." Once everything was set up, Angela and Michael began the process of reviewing the footage. "Let's take it day by day," Angela suggested, as they sat down to watch the first recordings. The first few days showed nothing unusual. Mrs. Rosa went about her daily routine, with Luis by her side, helping her move around the house, preparing her meals, and engaging in light conversation. For a moment, Angela and Michael began to relax. "Maybe it really is just the age," Michael said, his tone hopeful. But Angela wasn't ready to let go of her suspicion. Something still didn't feel right. As the days passed, the recordings revealed small but significant moments of frustration from Luis. At first, it was subtle, just a slight edge to his voice when Mrs. Rosa took too long to move from the chair or needed extra assistance. "Come on, Rosa, you need to hurry up," he muttered under his breath one afternoon as she struggled to stand. It wasn't exactly alarming, but it was enough to catch Angela's attention. "Did you hear that?" she asked Michael. "He's losing his patience with her." Michael shrugged. "It's frustrating, I get it. But that doesn't mean anything bad is happening." Angela wasn't so sure. She began to pay closer attention to every interaction between Luis and her mother. Each time she watched the footage, she felt a growing sense of unease. "I don't like the way he's talking to her," she said one evening as they reviewed another clip. "He's supposed to be taking care of her, not getting frustrated like that." Michael sighed, still not fully convinced. "Let's just keep watching. If there's something going on, we'll see it soon enough." And so they continued, day after day, searching for the truth that seemed to be hiding just out of reach. By the end of the first week, the footage still hadn't revealed anything overtly alarming, but Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Luis's patience was clearly wearing thin, and it showed in the way he moved around the house. His once gentle manner seemed to be slipping away, replaced by short, sharp movements and clipped tones. "He's starting to get annoyed," Angela said, more to herself than to Michael. "I don't like this." Michael remained cautious. "Let's not accuse him of anything without proof," he warned. But Angela was already on edge. One afternoon, as they reviewed the footage from the previous day, something happened that changed everything. In the video, Mrs. Rosa was trying to get up from her chair, her movements slow and labored. Luis stood nearby, watching. "Come on, Rosa, you can't take all day," he said, his voice sharper than usual. Mrs. Rosa struggled, but before she could fully stand, Luis gave her a rough push, sending her back into the chair with a thud. "Luis!" Angela gasped as she watched the scene unfold. Michael froze, his face going pale. "Did he just push her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. In that moment, everything shifted. The truth they had been searching for was finally in front of them, and it was far worse than they had imagined. Angela felt her heart race as she replayed the footage, watching Luis's expression, cold, impatient, and unkind. "We trusted him," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. Michael sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The truth had been revealed, and it was a painful blow. "We need to do something," Angela said, her voice shaking. "We can't let this continue." With the footage now showing clear evidence of mistreatment, Angela and Michael realized they had no choice but to act. They couldn't ignore what they had seen. Their mother was in danger, and they had to protect her. "We need to talk to Mom," Angela said firmly. "And we need to get Luis out of the house." Michael nodded, still reeling from the shock of what they had discovered. Their search for the truth had come to a heartbreaking conclusion, and now it was time to take action before anything worse happened. In the days that followed the installation of the cameras, Angela and Michael sat down to review the recordings with anticipation. "All right, let's see what's really going on here," Angela said, clicking on the first video. The initial footage showed Luis helping Mrs. Rosa with her everyday tasks, nothing out of the ordinary. He would assist her in getting up from the couch, guide her to the kitchen, and make sure she had her meals. Michael leaned back in his chair, somewhat relieved. "See, it's just as we thought. He's doing his job." Angela, though, wasn't so easily convinced. "Let's keep watching," she insisted, eyes glued to the screen. For the first few days, the routine remained consistent. Luis followed his usual pattern, preparing breakfast, helping Mrs. Rosa bathe, and spending time talking with her as they watched TV. At one point, Luis even read her a book, an old habit of theirs that Mrs. Rosa had always enjoyed. "Nothing seems out of place," Michael commented, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe we were overreacting after all. But Angela kept her reservations. She had felt something off for weeks now, and no amount of normalcy could shake that gut feeling. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she muttered. As the week progressed, Angela noticed small things in the footage that didn't sit right with her. While nothing glaringly wrong happened, Luis's demeanor seemed different at times. He would get frustrated when Mrs. Rosa took too long to get up or asked for help multiple times. "Did you hear that?" Angela asked Michael one night, playing back a moment where Luis had sighed loudly after helping Mrs. Rosa into her chair. "He's getting annoyed." Michael dismissed it. "He's human, Ong. Everyone gets frustrated sometimes. It doesn't mean anything." But Angela couldn't shake the unease. Luis's sighs became more frequent, and his tone, though not overtly harsh, carried an edge of impatience. "He's supposed to be caring for her, not getting irritated," Angela said, frowning as she watched yet another clip of Luis sighing as Mrs. Rosa struggled to stand. "Maybe it's nothing, but it's still unsettling." Michael, ever the pragmatist, remained skeptical. "You're looking for something that might not be there. Let's wait until we see something concrete before jumping to conclusions." The days rolled on, and still, the recordings showed little more than routine. Luis was present, performing his duties, and Mrs. Rosa went about her day. Angela, though vigilant, found herself questioning her own concerns. Was she really seeing signs of a problem, or was she simply looking too hard for something that wasn't there? Michael's reassurances made her doubt herself. "Maybe I am just being paranoid," she admitted one evening, rubbing her temples. Michael smiled slightly. "It's understandable. We've been so worried. But so far, there's no evidence of anything bad." However, the longer they watched, the more subtle shifts in Luis's behavior began to emerge. On one occasion, Mrs. Rosa asked Luis to help her with a glass of water. "Can you bring it here, Luis?" she asked, her voice gentle but tired. Luis paused, his face unreadable for a moment, before finally bringing the water over. "Here," he said, his tone clipped. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Did you see that? He's acting irritated again." Michael shrugged. "I mean, sure, but that's not abuse. He's probably just tired like the rest of us." As the second week approached, Angela and Michael's hopes of resolving the mystery without incident began to wane. The recordings continued to show normal daily activities, but Angela's intuition kept nagging at her. "Something still feels off," she told Michael one night as they reviewed the footage together. "I can't explain it, but it's there." Michael sighed, rubbing his eyes. I think we need to accept that maybe there's nothing more going on. He's doing his job. Maybe we've been too worried, and this is just how things are now with Mom." Angela, though mentally exhausted, refused to fully let go of her doubts. Louis's small displays of impatience, the subtle tension in the air, it all felt too much like a prelude to something worse. "We can't ignore this, Mike," she said softly. "Maybe it's nothing, but what if it's the beginning of something?" Michael remained quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. "I just don't want us to make accusations without any real proof," he said finally. "But you're right, we can't ignore what we feel." The calm facade of Louis's care was beginning to wear thin. While nothing drastic had happened yet, Angela could see the cracks forming. "People don't just snap all of a sudden," she mused one evening while watching another recording. "It builds up slowly. We might be catching the early signs of something worse." Michael looked at her, concern in his eyes. "What do you want to do? We can't confront him without evidence, and so far, all we have are some sighs and a little frustration." Angela didn't have an answer. All she knew was that something was wrong, and the cameras had yet to reveal the full truth. As the days passed, Angela became more anxious. The recordings continued to show nothing blatantly wrong, yet her sense of dread grew. "It's like waiting for the other shoe to drop," she told Michael, her voice thick with worry. "I know something's going to happen. We just haven't seen it yet." Michael, while more resigned, couldn't completely dismiss her feelings anymore. "Let's keep watching," he said, finally conceding. "We'll keep monitoring, and if anything happens, we'll be ready." Then, one evening, something small but significant happened. As they reviewed the footage from earlier in the day, they saw Louise helping Mrs. Rosa out of her chair. At first, it seemed like the usual routine. But as Mrs. Rosa struggled to stand, Louis's hand tightened around her arm, just a bit too forcefully. Angela froze, rewinding the clip. "Did you see that?" she asked, her heart racing. Michael leaned in, his face paling slightly. "Yeah, that wasn't normal." Angela's pulse quickened. "I knew it," she whispered. "It's starting." Though the incident was minor, it marked a turning point. Louis had been patient for weeks, but now, cracks in his facade were starting to show. Angela's unease shifted to full-blown anxiety. "We need to keep watching closely," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "If he's starting to lose control, things could escalate." Michael nodded, no longer the calm voice of reason. "You're right. We need to be ready for anything now." And with that, they braced themselves for whatever the recordings would reveal next. The tension had been building for days. Angela and Michael had spent hours watching the recordings, waiting for something to confirm their growing suspicions. One afternoon, as they reviewed yet another video, something finally happened. Mrs. Rosa was sitting in her usual spot, struggling to stand from her chair. Louis was nearby, as always, but this time, his expression was different. His face, usually calm and composed, showed signs of frustration. "Come on, Rosa, you can't be this slow every day," he muttered under his breath. Angela leaned in, her heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. As Mrs. Rosa tried to get up, Louis walked over and, without warning, pushed her back down into the chair. It wasn't a gentle nudge, It was a forceful shove that caused her to fall back with a thud. Angela gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He pushed her," she whispered, disbelief flooding her voice. Michael sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. "I can't believe this," he muttered, staring at the screen in shock. It was the moment they had feared but hoped would never come. The room fell silent as they replayed the clip, their hearts pounding in their chests. Angela's eyes filled with tears as she watched the scene unfold again and again. "How could we have let this happen?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael shook his head, still in disbelief. "We trusted him," he said, his voice hollow. The caregiver they had relied on for years had just revealed a side of himself they had never seen. Luis, the man who had been a part of their family's life for so long, was no longer the gentle caretaker they thought they knew. Angela couldn't shake the image of her mother being pushed down like that. "She didn't say anything," Angela whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "She just sat there. Why didn't she tell us?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Because she was afraid. She probably didn't want to cause any trouble or make us worry," he replied, anger building in his chest. The weight of what they had just witnessed settled heavily between them, and they knew they had to act. But how? They couldn't believe that someone they had trusted so deeply could be capable of such cruelty. As they continued watching the footage, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Luis's frustration with Mrs. Rosa had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time, and now it was boiling over. "Look at the way he talks to her," Angela said, her voice shaking with anger. In another clip, Luis was helping Mrs. Rosa walk to the kitchen, but his words were sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "Can't you move any faster?" "I don't have all day," he snapped at her, his tone full of irritation. Mrs. Rosa, frail and quiet, didn't respond, simply shuffling along at her slow pace. Michael clenched his fists as he watched the scene play out. "How could he talk to her like that?" he said, his voice thick with rage. Angela could feel the same anger building inside her. They had trusted Luis, invited him into their home, and now they were watching him treat their mother with utter disrespect. "We need to do something," Angela said, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't let this continue." Michael nodded in agreement, but the question remained, what could they do? They couldn't confront Luis without risking their mother's safety, and they needed to figure out how to handle the situation delicately. Angela knew they couldn't let their emotions take over, but it was hard to stay calm after seeing what Luis had done. "We need to call someone. Maybe a lawyer or the police," she suggested, but Michael hesitated. "Let's not jump to that yet. We need more evidence before we take any drastic steps. We can't just accuse him without having more to back it up." Angela understood his reasoning, but the thought of Luis continuing to mistreat their mother was unbearable. "How much more do we need to see before we act?" she asked, her voice shaking with frustration. They agreed to keep monitoring the footage closely, hoping that with more evidence, they could take stronger action. Every time they watched a new clip, they felt a sickening dread in the pit of their stomachs. "We have to protect her," Michael said one evening as they sat in front of the screen again. "We need to find a way to get him out of the house without putting her in danger." Angela nodded, knowing that they had to be strategic. The more they watched, the more they saw Luis's behavior becoming increasingly aggressive. It wasn't just physical abuse. The emotional manipulation was clear too. In one video, Mrs. Rosa asked Luis for help with her walker. He sighed loudly, rolling his eyes before helping her. "Do you have to be so helpless all the time?" he sneered. Angela's stomach churned as she watched her mother's reaction. Mrs. Rosa didn't say a word. She simply looked down, her shoulders slumped in defeat. "She's terrified of him," Angela said softly. Michael couldn't bring himself to speak. The reality of what was happening was hitting them harder than they had imagined. Their mother, A woman who had always been so strong was now trapped in a cycle of abuse. As the days passed, the evidence continued to mount. Every new recording seemed to reveal another layer of Louise's cruelty. The once patient and kind caregiver had become a menacing figure in their mother's life. Angela and Michael knew they had to act quickly, but they also needed to be careful. "We can't let him know we've seen this," Michael said one night as they discussed their next steps. "If he finds out, who knows what he might do?" Angela agreed, but the urgency of the situation was eating away at her. "I just want to get him out of there," she whispered, her voice full of pain. The weight of their discovery was overwhelming. They felt a mix of guilt, anger, and sadness as they realized how long this had been happening right under their noses. "How did we miss this?" Angela asked one night, her eyes red from crying. Michael put a hand on her shoulder. "We couldn't have known," he said softly. "But now that we do, we'll make sure it stops." Angela nodded, but the guilt still weighed heavily on her. They had trusted Louise with their mother's life, and now they had to face the fact that they had been wrong. The moment of discovery had shaken them to their core, but it also steeled their resolve. "We have to get him out of her life," Angela said firmly. Michael agreed. The time for watching and waiting was over. They needed to protect their mother, no matter what it took. With the evidence they had gathered, they were ready to confront the truth and take action. But as they prepared to move forward, they couldn't help but wonder what kind of emotional scars their mother had already endured. Mrs. Rosa had always been a fighter, but this battle had been fought in silence. As Angela and Michael continued reviewing the recordings, the full scope of Louise's abuse began to unfold. The emotional toll was almost unbearable. Each day, they discovered more incidents of mistreatment. It wasn't just physical abuse, though the rough shoves and aggressive handling were shocking enough. The real weight of it came from the constant emotional abuse, the way Louise would speak to their mother with cruelty laced into his words. "Can't you do anything by yourself anymore?" He sneered at her one afternoon when she asked for help getting up. Angela's heart sank each time she heard him speak like that. She could see the toll it was taking on Mrs. Rosa. Mrs. Rosa, who had always been so strong, now appeared more fragile than ever. The bruises on her arms and legs were only the surface. Her spirit seemed broken, and the recordings captured moments that were hard for Angela and Michael to watch. Louise's voice, once calm and reassuring, had become biting and condescending. "Hurry up, Rosa. I don't have all day," he would say, often when she struggled to move. Mrs. Rosa would remain silent, her head bowed in submission, as if she had resigned herself to this treatment. The abuse was a silent cycle, one that had gone on without their knowledge for far too long. Angela couldn't help but feel guilty. "How could we have let this happen?" she asked Michael one night, her voice full of pain. Michael, equally devastated, tried to reassure her, but the guilt weighed heavily on them both. They had trusted Louise to care for their mother, to be her support when they couldn't be there. Now they were faced with the reality that they had been blind to the suffering she had endured. "We have to do something," Angela said, her voice filled with a mix of anger and determination. Michael nodded in agreement, but the question of how to proceed still hung over them. The abuse had a routine, a cycle that repeated itself day after day. Every morning, Louise would arrive at the house with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. He would go through the motions of caregiving, making breakfast, helping Mrs. Rosa out of bed, but there was always an underlying tension. The smallest inconvenience seemed to trigger his frustration. If Mrs. Rosa took too long to respond, Louise's patience would snap. "You're useless," he muttered under his breath one afternoon, after she had struggled to pick up her glass of water. Angela clenched her fists as she watched the footage, her heart aching for her mother. The emotional abuse was constant, wearing Mrs. Rosa down bit by bit. She no longer smiled as often as she used to, and her once vibrant energy had dimmed. Michael noticed it too, the way she seemed quieter when they visited. "She doesn't talk as much as she used to," he said one evening as they reviewed the recordings. Angela nodded, her eyes focused on the screen. "She's afraid," she replied. "Afraid of him, afraid of causing trouble." It was heartbreaking to see their once strong, independent mother reduced to a shell of herself, all because of Louis's relentless cruelty. One of the most painful things for Angela and Michael was seeing how Mrs. Rosa never spoke up about the abuse. Even in moments where it was clear she was being mistreated, she stayed silent. "Why didn't she tell us?" Angela asked one evening, her voice full of sorrow. Michael, though just as upset, understood their mother's reasoning. "She didn't want to be a burden," he said softly. "She probably thought she could handle it on her own. Or maybe she was afraid we wouldn't believe her." The thought that their mother had been suffering in silence was almost too much to bear. The physical abuse was just as horrifying. Angela and Michael had already seen the rough shoves, but there were other moments, more subtle, yet just as damaging. Louis would grip Mrs. Rosa's arm too tightly when helping her up, leaving marks that she would later explain away as accidental. "I probably just bumped into something," she would say when Angela asked about the bruises. Now, they knew the truth. They could see it in the recordings, the way Louis would grab her, pull her roughly, or shove her back into her chair when he lost patience. "He's been hurting her for months," Angela said quietly, her voice trembling with anger. The abuse extended beyond the physical realm. The emotional manipulation Louis employed was cruel in its subtlety. He would belittle Mrs. Rosa, making her feel like a burden. "You'd think by now you'd know how to do this yourself," he said coldly one day as she struggled to tie her robe. Mrs. Rosa's hands trembled, but she said nothing, only lowering her head in shame. Angela couldn't stand to watch it anymore. "He's breaking her spirit," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, sharing her pain. The realization that their mother had been enduring this alone was devastating. Angela and Michael began to piece together the timeline of abuse, realizing that it had likely been going on for much longer than they had originally thought. Every bruise, every cut, every fall, they now understood that many of these injuries hadn't been accidents at all. Louis had been careful to keep his temper in check when they were around, but the recordings showed the truth. "We should have known," Michael said, shaking his head in frustration. "We should have seen the signs." Angela nodded, feeling the same guilt. But they couldn't dwell on the past. They had to act now. As they gathered more and more evidence, Angela and Michael knew they couldn't let this continue. Their mother had suffered in silence for too long, and it was time to put an end to it. But the question remained, how could they safely remove Louis from their mother's life without putting her in further danger? Confronting him outright could be risky. What if he retaliated? "We need a plan," Angela said, her mind racing. "We can't just kick him out without making sure Mom is safe first." Michael agreed. They needed to be smart about this, to make sure they could protect Mrs. Rosa without escalating the situation. Angela started researching elder abuse and how to handle it legally. "We need to report this," she told Michael. "There are laws in place to protect people like Mom." Michael agreed, but he was still hesitant. What if Louis finds out before we can get her out of the house? What if he hurts her again? Angela understood his fear. They were walking a fine line, balancing their desire to protect their mother with the need to keep her safe in the short term. But they knew they couldn't let the abuse continue. It was time to end the cycle of violence once and for all. The cycle of abuse had been a silent one, but now Angela and Michael were determined to break it. They had gathered enough evidence, and with every new recording, their resolve grew stronger. Their mother's safety was their top priority, and they would do whatever it took to ensure she was no longer under Louis's control. "We have to protect her," Angela said, her voice filled with determination. Michael nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "We will," he replied. The silent cycle of violence was coming to an end, and they were ready to take the next steps to make sure it never happened again. When Angela and Michael finally decided to act, the weight of their decision felt overwhelming. They had spent days gathering evidence, reviewing the footage over and over, but now came the hardest part, confronting the situation head-on. "We need to get Luis out of there, and we need to do it carefully," Angela said, her voice firm but trembling with the gravity of what they were about to do. Michael agreed. "We'll call the authorities first, and then we'll confront him," he suggested. Angela nodded, knowing they had to handle this delicately to protect their mother. Their goal was clear: justice for Mrs. Rosa and her protection above all else. The next morning, they reached out to a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. "You've done the right thing by documenting everything," the lawyer said after reviewing the footage. "With this evidence, we can take legal action and ensure Luis faces the consequences of his actions." Angela and Michael felt a sense of relief knowing they were no longer alone in this fight. "We want to make sure our mother is safe," Michael emphasized. The lawyer reassured them, explaining the steps they would take to not only remove Luis from the house but also press charges for the abuse Mrs. Rosa had endured. Once they had the legal groundwork in place, they needed to speak to Mrs. Rosa about what was happening. "How do we tell her?" Angela asked Michael, her voice full of uncertainty. Mrs. Rosa had always been a woman of pride and independence, and Angela knew this conversation would be difficult. "We'll have to be gentle," Michael said softly. "We need to explain that this isn't her fault, and that we're doing this to protect her." They both sat down with their mother that evening, preparing themselves for the conversation. "Mom, we need to talk to you about Luis," Angela began, her heart heavy. At first, Mrs. Rosa seemed confused. She looked from Angela to Michael, unsure of where this conversation was going. "What about Luis?" she asked, her voice soft. Angela and Michael exchanged glances before Michael spoke up. "Mom, we've seen the recordings. We know that Luis has been mistreating you," he said gently, watching his mother's reaction closely. Mrs. Rosa's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped, and the truth that she had been hiding for so long finally surfaced. "I didn't want to worry you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Angela reached out, holding her mother's hand. "Mom, we're so sorry. We should have seen this sooner," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Mrs. Rosa shook her head. "It wasn't your fault. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought I could handle it," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The pain in her words was clear, and it broke Angela and Michael's hearts to see their mother, who had always been so strong, feeling so powerless. "You're not a burden, Mom," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to make sure you're safe from now on." With Mrs. Rosa now fully aware of what was happening, Angela and Michael knew they had to act quickly. The lawyer had already advised them on how to remove Luis from the house legally and safely. They contacted the local authorities, who were ready to intervene if necessary. "We'll be there to ensure everything goes smoothly," the lawyer reassured them. Angela felt a knot in her stomach as they prepared for the confrontation. She knew that once Luis realized he was being removed, things could escalate. "We need to make sure Mom isn't alone when we do this," she said. Michael agreed. The day of the confrontation arrived, and tension filled the air. Angela and Michael, with the lawyer and police on standby, waited for Luis to arrive at the house. When he walked through the door, completely unaware of what was about to happen, Michael stepped forward. "Luis, we need to talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. Luis glanced at him, then at Angela, sensing that something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice defensive. Angela felt her heart race as she stepped closer. "We know what you've been doing, Luis," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "It's over." Luis's expression changed instantly, his usual calm demeanor slipping away as panic set in. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but Angela cut him off. "We've seen the recordings. We know everything." At that moment, the police officers entered the room. Luis froze, realizing there was no escape. "You're under investigation for elder abuse," one of the officers said, stepping forward. Luis's face went pale as they escorted him out of the house. For Angela and Michael, it was a moment of justice, but it didn't take away the pain of knowing what their mother had been through. After Luis was taken away, there was a strange silence in the house. Mrs. Rosa sat quietly in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. Angela and Michael rushed to her side. "It's over now, Mom," Angela said softly, kneeling beside her. Mrs. Rosa looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with both relief and sadness. "I never wanted it to come to this," she whispered. Michael sat down next to her. "You didn't deserve any of this, Mom. We're going to make sure you're safe from now on." The emotional toll of the day weighed heavily on all of them, but for the first time in months, there was a sense of relief. With Luis gone, the next step was to ensure Mrs. Rosa received the care she deserved. Angela and Michael hired a new caregiver, someone recommended by the lawyer who specialized in elderly care and had a spotless reputation. "We'll make sure this person is different," Michael assured his mother. The house was also outfitted with more security measures, including additional cameras and safety features, to give everyone peace of mind. Mrs. Rosa, though shaken, began to slowly trust again. The journey to healing would be long, but with her family by her side, she knew she could face it. Angela and Michael, while still haunted by the guilt of not having acted sooner, were determined to move forward and focus on their mother's well-being. "We can't change what happened, but we can make sure it never happens again," Angela said as she hugged Mrs. Rosa tightly. The family's bond, though tested by the trauma they had endured, grew stronger as they navigated this difficult chapter together. For Mrs. Rosa, the road to recovery was not just about healing her physical wounds, but also mending the emotional scars left behind by the abuse. And she knew that, with her family's support, she would eventually find peace again. With Luis finally out of their lives, a new chapter began for Mrs. Rosa, one focused on healing and rebuilding. The first few days after the confrontation were quiet, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. "I feel lighter," Mrs. Rosa admitted to Angela one morning as they sat together in the living room. For the first time in months, there was no tension hanging over her, no fear of what Luis might say or do. Yet, despite this newfound sense of freedom, the emotional scars he left behind still weighed heavily on her. She knew that physical healing would come faster than the emotional. Angela and Michael were determined to make this new phase as comfortable as possible for their mother. They brought in a new caregiver, carefully vetted and recommended by professionals who specialized in elder care. Her name was Cynthia, and from the moment she stepped into the house, her warm and gentle demeanor set a different tone. "Hi, Mrs. Rosa," Cynthia said with a smile, taking her hand. "I'm here to help you in any way you need." Mrs. Rosa, though hesitant at first, felt an immediate sense of comfort around her. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild, though the wounds of betrayal were still fresh. The days that followed were quiet but filled with small moments of joy. Angela and Michael visited more frequently, not just to check on their mother, but to spend time with her in a way they hadn't in months. "It's good to have you both here," Mrs. Rosa said one afternoon as they sat around the kitchen table. They laughed and shared stories, trying to recapture some of the lightness that had been lost during the months of abuse. "We miss this, Mom," Michael said, his voice soft but filled with love. Slowly, Mrs. Rosa's spirit began to lift. She wasn't just healing physically, she was rediscovering her joy. As Cynthia settled into her role, Mrs. Rosa began to regain some of the independence she had lost. "I can help you walk, but I want you to try standing on your own first," Cynthia encouraged her one morning. It was a small step, but a significant one. Mrs. Rosa, with a determination that had been hidden for months, slowly pushed herself up from her chair. Her legs wobbled at first, but Cynthia's reassuring presence kept her steady. "That's it, you're doing great," Cynthia said, her voice calm and supportive. Mrs. Rosa smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in a long time. The healing process wasn't without its challenges. There were days when Mrs. Rosa struggled, not just with the physical limitations of her age, but with the emotional aftermath of the abuse. "Some days I wake up and wonder how I let it happen," she confessed to Angela one afternoon. Angela sat beside her, holding her hand. "It wasn't your fault, Mom," she reminded her. "You were strong enough to survive it, and that's what matters." Mrs. Rosa nodded, but the weight of those months still lingered. The journey of overcoming was slow, but with each passing day, she grew a little stronger. The support from her family was crucial. Angela and Michael, though initially plagued by guilt for not having noticed the signs sooner, made sure to be present for their mother in every way. "We're here for you, Mom, no matter what," Michael would often say, and Mrs. Rosa found comfort in their presence. She began to open up more, talking about the fear and loneliness she had felt during those dark months. "I didn't want to worry you," she explained one evening, her voice quiet but steady. "But I should have told you sooner." Angela hugged her tightly, assuring her that the past was behind them now. One of the most important parts of Mrs. Rosa's recovery was finding a new sense of purpose. Cynthia, understanding the importance of mental and emotional stimulation for her well-being, introduced activities that brought joy back into Mrs. Rosa's life. They started with small things: gardening, cooking, and reading. "Let's get you back to doing the things you love," Cynthia said one afternoon as they worked in the small garden behind the house. Mrs. Rosa, though hesitant at first, began to find peace in these simple tasks. "It feels good to use my hands again," she admitted, feeling the earth between her fingers. Her faith, too, played a significant role in her healing. Mrs. Rosa had always been a woman of strong belief, and during her recovery, she leaned on that faith more than ever. "I prayed every day," she told Angela one evening as they sat together on the porch. "It's what kept me going." Angela smiled, knowing how much strength her mother had drawn from her faith over the years. Together, they began attending church more regularly, reconnecting with a community that had always been a source of comfort for Mrs. Rosa. "I'm starting to feel like myself again," she said after one service, her voice filled with quiet hope. As time went on, Mrs. Rosa's physical health improved significantly. The bruises and cuts had healed, and with Cynthia's help, she had regained much of her strength. "You're walking better every day," Cynthia said, encouraging her progress. But the real transformation was happening within. Mrs. Rosa was rediscovering her inner strength, the same resilience that had carried her through so many hardships in life. "I've been through a lot, but I'm still here," she told Michael one day, a quiet but powerful statement of her survival. Her journey wasn't just about overcoming the abuse, it was about reclaiming her life. For Angela and Michael, seeing their mother's recovery was both a relief and a lesson. "She's the strongest person I know," Michael said one day as he and Angela sat together, reflecting on the months that had passed. "I don't know how she got through it." Angela nodded. "She did it because she had to. And now she's showing us how to move forward." Their mother's strength had become a source of inspiration for both of them. They realized that, despite the pain and guilt they had felt for not acting sooner, the most important thing was that they had come together as a family when it mattered most. As Mrs. Rosa entered this new phase of her life, there was a sense of peace in the house that hadn't been there for a long time. The fear and tension that had once filled the air were gone, replaced by laughter, conversations, and quiet moments of reflection. "We're going to be okay," Mrs. Rosa said one day, looking at Angela and Michael with a small but confident smile. Her journey of rebuilding and overcoming had been difficult, but with her family by her side, she knew she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time in months, Mrs. Rosa felt truly at peace. Now that you've seen what unfolded in Mrs. Rosa's life, the real question is, what would you do if it were your loved one? How often do we overlook the small signs, brushing them off as mere accidents or coincidences, without digging deeper? This story teaches us that vigilance is key, especially when it comes to those who depend on us. It's not just about caring for the elderly, it's about protecting the vulnerable in our lives. Abuse often hides in plain sight, So, are you ready to take action in your own life? What steps will you take to ensure the safety and well-being of the people you love? Don't wait for the evidence to mount up like Angela and Michael did. Start asking the hard questions now. And if you've learned something valuable from this story, make sure you apply it. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay informed. We'll continue to share stories and lessons like this, ones that can help you protect your family and make a difference. Because knowledge isn't just power, it's protection.